everybody should be concerned about. So we like to start with the example of an illustrative child. So this is not a real child, it's just a child we use as an example. And we're going to look at the amount of funding that Deshawn's district would receive to educate him, depending on where he goes to school. So one comment I just quickly want to make about per pupil expenditures. In Connecticut, per pupil expenditures are only available at the district level. They're not available at the individual school level. As all of you know, the school district does not just take the amount of money they have and then divide it by their total enrollment and then distribute it equally across the district. Instead, they make different kinds of funding decisions. So what you'll see here is the amount of money that the district is receiving, and then of course that district is making decisions about how they divide that money up between their schools. So Deshawn lives in Bridgeport, and he is a 10th grader, and when he grows up, he wants to be an engineer. So how much funding does Deshawn's school district receive to educate him? And in Connecticut, the answer to this is that it depends on where he lives. So today we're going to take a look at 3 different school districts for this illustrative child example. So we're going to look, of course, at Bridgeport Public Schools, where we are today. We're going to look at neighboring Fairfield Public Schools, and then we're going to look at Hartford Public Schools, which, although it's a little bit far away from here, as you all know, is one of the districts that's most like Bridgeport, so we're going to use it as a comparison. All right, so if Deshawn goes here, say to Central High School, Bridgeport Public Schools is going to receive $13,933 per pupil. Of that, $9,700 is going to come from the state of Connecticut. We're going to see that about $2,868 comes from the city of Bridgeport. So that's the money that Bridgeport is contributing through their municipal property taxes on a per pupil basis to kids who are going to Bridgeport Public Schools. And then there's about $1,300 in other contributions. So that includes all of the other money that comes into the district. That would be all of the federal money. That would be any money that comes in through philanthropic sources or any other sources. We just bundle all of those together. On our website, you can see an individual breakdown. Yes?
So based on what year is these numbers?
So this is the data for the most recent school year that ended. So this is the 14-15 school year. Or actually, that's not the one that just ended, it's the prior year that ended. So this is the most, I forget that we've actually now ended the school year. So this is the most recently available data from the State Department of Education for net current expenditures per pupil. And you can go to our website there where you see that URL and you can download the whole list. So now we're going to say, okay, what if Deshawn's family moved to Fairfield, which is right next door, right? So we're going to see in Fairfield that Deshawn's district would receive $15,936 per student to educate him. So the breakdown here is going to look a lot different, right? So Fairfield is a wealthier district. They're going to get about $748 per student from the state. Fairfield taxpayers are going to contribute about $14,917, and they're going to get about $271 in other contributions, right? Yes?
Question. The ratio of students in Fairfield to Bridgeport?
So you mean the number of
Yes.
students? Okay, so we'll have a slide that's going to talk a little bit about enrollment later on, but this is on a per pupil basis, right? So what we've done is we've taken the total amount of funding that the district has available and then divided it by the total number of students in the district to give us a per pupil expenditure, right? Because otherwise, if we're comparing between a very large district like Bridgeport and a much smaller district like Fairfield, you're obviously going to see that the total budget size of Bridgeport is going to be much larger because you're educating much more students. But Fairfield's budget, again, in absolute terms is going to be smaller because they're educating fewer students. But when we compare between districts, we want to look at how much money they're spending per pupil because that gives us an opportunity to sort of do an apples to apples comparison of how much money they have for each kid. And then next, what if Deshawn's family moved to Hartford and he went to school there? So if Deshawn's family moved to Hartford, Hartford Public Schools receives $19,342 per pupil. Of that, we're going to see that the state contribution is $13,282 per pupil. And if you recall, when we looked at this for Bridgeport, right, it was just a little bit over $9,000. So Hartford receives more than $3,500 more on a per student basis just from the state of Connecticut. And when we think about that in terms of the whole school district budget, so both Bridgeport and Hartford serve about 20,000 students apiece, right? So when you multiply for every $1,000 per pupil difference, that's a $20 million difference in the school district's budget. So $3,500 per pupil, that's a lot of money, right? The city of Hartford, from its taxpayers, is going to contribute about $4,200 per pupil. And we're going to go through all of these numbers individually, but if you'll remember, that is also significantly larger than what Bridgeport is contributing on a per pupil basis. And then in other contributions, they're getting a pretty similar amount of money. They're getting about $1,820. It's a little bit more, but not the disparity that we saw before. All right. So we've lined all those numbers up against each other just so you can take a look at them. And as we can see, even though Deshaun is the same student that has the same set of needs, all of the different school districts that he goes to are going to receive a different amount of money to educate him. And this will be different no matter what Connecticut public school district he goes to. We can see here that the range is about $5,400 per pupil between Bridgeport and Hartford, which is a pretty significant amount of money. And so also just taking a little bit of a look at property taxes, and we'll talk more about property taxes as we go through this, but we've also done a breakdown of how much would Deshaun's family pay in property taxes on a $200,000 house in each of these towns. So in Bridgeport,
That's a totally different number at this point, I can assure you.
yeah, so we have a little further.
Yeah, that is
We have a little further in this slide,
That's
some
crazy.
information about the updated grand list and the updated mill rate. But for the, again, so the most recent comparable year, we don't yet have data from all the municipalities for their fiscal year 17, although yes, we did put in Bridgeport's updated number. We can see that a family in Bridgeport, they own the same house in Bridgeport, Fairfield, or Hartford, is going to pay a really different amount of money in property taxes, right? So in Bridgeport, in FY16, they would have paid $5,900, as some of you have alluded to. That number is going to go up. In Fairfield, that family would pay about $3,400 for that house, and in Hartford, they would pay about $4,400. And I'll just make a quick mention here about Hartford's mill rate, which we'll see a little bit later. People see that Hartford has a very high mill rate. It's currently 74. But one of the things to know about Hartford is that they have a different assessment schedule for real property. So that's like physical buildings than the rest of the state. In the rest of the state, property is assessed at 70% of its value. But in Hartford, it's assessed at 30% of its value for real property. So even though that number, that mill rate number looks really high, when we actually do the calculation of the reality of how much is a family paying, it's not as high as it might initially seem.
Katie, that number, by the way, if you use the new bill rate, is 7,600. No.
7,600, if you, yeah, 600,
Yes,
yeah.
ma'am.
So that is an example of just one child going to 3 different school systems in Connecticut. And what we're going to try to talk about in this presentation is, right, why are we seeing those huge differences? So just starting with a little bit of an overview. So why is school finance a state level issue? So in some of the other areas that we talk about, things like fair housing, we'll see that there's a lot of activity in the federal courts around those issues, but we don't see that happening on school finance. And there's a very specific reason for that. So in a 1973 court case, San Antonio School District versus Rodriguez, which is sort of very famous in the school finance world, the United States Supreme Court determined that education is not considered to be a fundamental right under the United States Constitution. As a result, the school finance systems of states are not subject to strict scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause. And as a result, it is not unconstitutional for property wealthy districts to be able to spend much more on their public schools than property poor districts. The result of this case is that public schools fall under the authority of state government, and they are primarily funded through state and local tax dollars, as most of us know. The reason that we see free public education in all 50 states is that all 50 states have individually concluded that their state constitutions provide a right to a free public education using different wording. It's not the same in all states, but in all 50 states, which is why we see that as a universal right across the country, but education is not considered a fundamental right under the United States Constitution. So what happened in 1973 is that all of that school finance litigation got pushed down to the state level, right? So there can't be any more well, unless you want to challenge this particular case, no more federal litigation on school finance systems. We have seen school finance litigation happen at the state level in about 45 states. In about half of those states, the plaintiffs have prevailed. And when we look at the outcomes of those cases, some of what we see is whether or not that state Supreme Court case has an impact on the school finance system in that state really depends on what the legislative and executive branch decide to do with that ruling. So the legislative branch always has the power to appropriate funding. That's the case in Connecticut, and that's the case in other states. So as a result, they are the final decision makers both about how much money is allocated to education and how those funds are allocated to schools and districts. So even when there's a court case, it's still the legislature who ends up having to make those decisions. And as some of you are probably familiar with, Connecticut has a very long-running school finance case, the CJEF case, which Superintendent Rabinowitz testified at this spring. So that case has been in the Connecticut courts for about 10 years now. It made its way up to the Supreme Court for an initial ruling, then went back to the Superior Court to be heard again. That happened over the course of this spring. It was a very long trial for any of those of you like me who were following that through the motion briefs online. It will take some time to get a Superior Court ruling in that case, and then there will be an appeals process that can proceed from there. So it's probably going to continue to be a number of years before there is a final determinative judgment in CJEF, and Connecticut does not have a prescriptive court, so it's not a court that will say this is exactly what you have to do. Instead, Connecticut's Supreme Court, if they were to find in favor of the plaintiffs, would likely say to the legislative and executive branch, yes, we have determined the system is unconstitutional, now you need to fix it, which would leave us in many ways in the place that we're in today. So as a result, the work that we do, we spend a lot of time working directly with policymakers. This year we spent a lot of time just on education around school finance and helping them to better understand this issue, because it really is an issue that the legislature, whether it's now or later, is going to have to take on. And it's important that they have an understanding of how the system works. So, what are the funding sources for public education in Connecticut? So going back to the big picture a little bit. So Connecticut spends about $10.5 billion a year in total on public education. Connecticut gets very little federal funding. So this little green line you see at the top, Connecticut gets a little less than $500 million a year in federal funding. It is less than 5% of all of the public education funding in Connecticut. I think it might now be down to less than 4%. We dropped down this year. We just got these new numbers. So that is, a lot of us are familiar with federal funding. That's Title I, Title II, Title III, IDEA funding. But there isn't a lot of it. So even in a district like Bridgeport, the last time I checked, only about 7.5% of Bridgeport's budget came from federal funds. So it's just not a huge player in the Connecticut school finance landscape. And the reason for this is that on the whole, Connecticut is a relatively small, relatively wealthy state. So we don't receive huge amounts of money through federal programs, right? In other states, you might see that that's 12 or more percent, but in Connecticut, it's relatively little. So next, the state here is in this red box. So the state of Connecticut spends about $4.1 billion a year on public education. That is about 39% of all public education spending. And for those of you who are familiar with things like the education cost sharing grant amount being about $2 billion, this number will look really high to you. This is the US Census Bureau's number. This captures two types of funding that we don't always think about as being related to education. The first is our teacher retirement benefits are in Connecticut 100% state paid. And a lot of states, those are shared between the state and municipalities, but that is a public education expenditure in Connecticut. It's paid at the state level, so that's incorporated into that $4.1 billion. And additionally, money related to school construction and school construction bonds that Connecticut needs to pay off over time. So obviously we have many public school buildings in this state. As you probably know, the state, in many cases, particularly in our higher need areas, has made significant contributions to building those schools, and those are bonds that need to be paid off over time, so those bond payments are captured in here. And then finally, we see from local government about $5.9 billion. So that is the majority of the funding. It's about 57% of the total funding. That is all of the money that folks are paying through their local property taxes that are then going towards operating their local public school systems. Also, when we think a little bit about how Connecticut compares to other states, Connecticut is right near the top of the list on most local contributions. So there's more money coming from local sources in Connecticut as a percentage of the whole pie than in a lot of other states. Yeah.
Just real quick
Yeah.
question. Based on that, will there be a slide comparing what Bridgeport contributes to what the other municipalities?
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, just a quick reiteration. So we're not going to talk a lot about federal funding during this presentation, and that's because, as I noted, it makes up a very small percentage of the overall funding. So instead, we are going to focus primarily on state and local.
I thought I had, but no.
So the next question, as we can see, we have a pretty wide diversity of funding amounts in Connecticut, and one of the things that we frequently talk about is funding students based on their learning needs, right? So when we talk about the difference between equality and equity, we talk about the different learning needs of students. So I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with these terms from your work with the school system, but equality is about sameness, right? So if we were going to distribute school funding equally in Connecticut, what we would do is we would take the total amount of education funding that was available, we would divide it by the total number of public school children we have, and everybody would get the same amount of money. But when we talk about school funding, we like to talk about distributing school funding equitably, which is about fairness and access to opportunity. So as you know, not all children come to school with the same set of learning needs. Children, when they come to school, we have children who live in low-income situations, we have children who are English language learners, we have children who have special education needs, and those children need different types of resources in order to be able to have access to the same educational opportunities. So as we can see in this picture, right, so we have 3 children of different heights, which can sort of symbolize different sets of learning needs. If we divide our resources, which are our boxes, equally, we can see that what happens is that 2 of the children can see over the fence, but 1 of the children cannot. When we divide our resources, again our boxes, equitably, we can see that all 3 of the children are able to see over the fence. And when we're allocating our education resources, we want to make sure that we're allocating those resources in a way that ensure that all children have access to educational opportunities.
I just want to say this slide kind of says it all.
Yeah.
It really does. Just looking at that, it really says it all.
I did not invent this slide. I cannot take credit for it. It's a slide that you may have seen in other places, but I think it does a really nice job of demonstrating the differences. Just to frame a little bit some of the challenges and potential supports that might be needed for different types of learning needs. Most of the time, when we're talking about learning needs, we're talking about English language learners and students with disabilities. People maybe have a picture in their mind of what those additional resources might look like, but sometimes it's a little bit less clear when we're talking about a student who's living in a low-income situation. So there are a number of potential challenges that children who are living in low-income situations might face. They may live in an unstable housing situation where they are either homeless or frequently moving from house to house. They may be food insecure or have a lack of access to healthy foods. Their parents, because of work commitments, may be less able to dedicate time and resources to education. It's possible that they've been exposed to trauma or other types of unsafe situations that can impact their readiness to learn on a daily basis. They're more likely to be absent from school. Chronic absenteeism has a greater prevalence among children who live in low-income situations. And many children may also have limited language capabilities. So many of you have probably heard about the 30 million word study. So children who are living in low-income households by the age of 3 are in many cases hearing 30 million less words than those coming from more affluent homes. And that can have an impact on the child's readiness to read and readiness to communicate verbally. So there's a number of potential supports that might be necessary to help give low-income students the same type of access to education opportunities. So to help with some of that limited language capability. We might need additional reading interventionists to work with them to help them get their reading skills where they need to be. They may need software to help them build their vocabulary and develop language skills. They may need services of the social worker or other social services to help make sure that their family has housing and is food secure, or to deal with some of those traumatic or unsafe situations that they've been exposed to. These are obviously generalizations. Every child that comes to school is going to come to school with a unique set of learning needs, could come with a combination of things off this list or different needs altogether. But we do know from research that in general, children who are living in low-income situations do need additional access to opportunities, or additional access to resources to access the same opportunities. So the other question that comes up a lot when I'm talking about school finance, so I like to deal with it right off the top, is this question of does money matter? So the first thing that I want to say is there has been a lot of scholarly debate on this issue. There has been a lot of debate in education policy circles. If there is general agreement that it costs more than $1 per child to operate a public school system, we know that money must have some impact on what we're able to do, right? And I think the difficulty is in measuring just how much money do we need, but obviously resources have some impact on our ability to deliver services to children. I want to talk here a little bit about some of the shifting scholarly debate on this topic. So the early studies, which were these very large meta-studies on whether or not the amount of funding a school received had an impact on student outcomes, really originates with the 1966 Coleman Report, which was a presidential report. They found no clear relationship between school funding and student outcomes in that report. And that sort of set the education policy world on a course of sort of questioning, do resources matter in student outcomes? And some of this was reinforced in the late 90s and early 2000s by Eric Hanishek, who again did some of these big meta-studies and found overall that resource policies had not led to discernible improvements in student performance. But we see that some of that academic debate has been shifting, particularly very recently. So there are 3 new studies that have all come out in the last couple of years that now that we have better data and statistical software have taken closer looks at the impact of resources on kids. And the first study is actually is a very, very large study looking across a large number of kids. And what they found is that for low-income students, a 10% increase in per pupil spending for all 12 years of public education. So that doesn't mean 10% additional every year, but if it was increased 10% for all 12 years, was associated with 0.43 additional years of completed education, 9.5% higher adult earnings, and a 6.8 percentage point reduction in the annual incidence of adult poverty. So we see there's some impact on the long-term life outcomes that we're looking for kids. We also saw from a Candelaria and Shore study from Stanford University, they found that 7 years after reform, the highest poverty quartile, so those students most in need, had a 4 to 12%, who had a 4 to 12% increase in per pupil spending, had a 5 to 8 percentage point increase in graduation rates. And the final paper used representative samples from NAEP, and they found that school finance reforms caused gradual increases in the relative achievement of students from low-income school districts. So part of what we're seeing here is that resources invested in low-income children, children with the highest needs, do seem to have an impact both on their school careers and their longer-term life outcomes. So to shift a little bit now to talk a little bit about the state and about Bridgeport. So one of the things that we have seen happening in Connecticut over the last 10 years is that there has been a decline in the total number of public school students. So over the last 10 years, we have seen about a 6% decline in the total number of children attending public school in Connecticut. And the reason for this is that there are simply fewer children in the state between the ages of 5 and 19 years old. Connecticut, like many states in the country, particularly in the Northeast, is seeing a demographic shift. Essentially, the population is getting older. The result of that is that we have fewer school-age children, which means that there are fewer children in schools. But the important thing to know is that this decline has not been uniform across the state over the last 10 years. In general, our more urban, higher need districts have either remained stable or seen a bit of an increase in enrollment, while many of our suburban communities have seen a decline, particularly some of our rural communities in the northeastern part of the state. There's a projected additional 12% decline in school enrollment over the next 10 years. That's from work that was done by the Connecticut Data Center at UConn. If you go on our website, you can see a link to that work, and you can see a district by district breakdown, and I think we'll see some of the projections in here. So, as I just said, the enrollment decline of 6% has not been consistent across the state, and Bridgeport is an example of that. So here we see Bridgeport Public Schools enrollment over the last 10 years, and we see that rather than declining by 6%, we've seen that it has increased slightly, just slightly, by about 0.56% over the last 10-year period, but it certainly hasn't seen the drop that we've seen in those other districts. And when we look forward in time over the next decade at Bridgeport's school-age population, so that's going to be children between the ages of 5 and 19, you're going to see this is higher than your school district enrollment. Not all children go to school, some children go to private school, so it's going to be a little bit higher. But you're going to see that it's projected that there may be a pretty stable to perhaps slight increase in the number of school-age children in Bridgeport, which looks a lot different than many of the other districts in the state. As many of you know, Bridgeport is the third largest district in the state. Bridgeport's enrollment for 2015-16 was 21,191 students, just about the same size as Hartford and New Haven public schools, and larger than the districts that follow of Waterbury, Stamford, and Norwalk. The other thing that we see is that student need is both increasing around the state and increasing in Bridgeport. So here we're looking at the trends statewide in low-income ELL and special education populations over the last 10 years. So this is the incidence rate, the percent of all students who are identified as having one of these needs. That top blue line is the percentage of children who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. Many of you are probably familiar with the fact that we use free and reduced price lunch as an indicator for children who are living in low-income situations. Many of you, particularly here in Bridgeport, may also be familiar with the community eligibility provision of the United States Department of Agriculture Free and Reduced Price Meals Program. The community eligibility provision is a great provision because its goal is to get food to more children who need it. The problem that it causes for education researchers is it makes free and reduced price lunch numbers not a good proxy for low-income students. For example, one of the things that we've seen happen here in Bridgeport is we see that 100% of children in Bridgeport are eligible for free and reduced price lunch when we look district-wide, which is great because it means that children across the district can get free meals. But as those of you living here in Bridgeport know, not actually 100% of all children living in Bridgeport are low-income. And one of the things that we're going to see around the state is that we're going to see a number of other districts come up to 100% free and reduced price lunch. Same set of circumstances, not actually 100% of those children are going to be low income. And in here, I think we're going to have a slide that looks at the actual federal poverty rate, which is going to be lower. We just released a paper a couple of weeks ago about a new potential proxy for measuring low income children in the state. Basically, nationwide, we're going to have to come up with a new way of measuring low income children. We looked at a number of different methods, and the one that we have proposed is to take the list of direct certification indicators, which are things like eligibility for SNAP, which is food stamps, eligibility for, we call it TFA in Connecticut, it's called TANF nationally, it's temporary assistance to needy families, families who are unemployed, there's a few other factors, homeless children, and to add to that, children who are eligible to receive Husky A, which is Children's Medicaid in Connecticut, and to use that as a new proxy for those factors together as a new proxy for measuring low-income students in our state. So just be aware over the next few years, free and reduced price lunch is probably something that is going to get phased out. But it's something we have been using over the last 10 years, and we've seen about an 11 percentage point increase in the percent of children who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch in the state. So it was about 26% up to maybe 38% in the most recent year. And this basically means that overall in the state we have more low-income kids, right? We additionally have seen in recent years a very small spike in the special education incidence rate. It's now up to about 13% statewide. Our ELL numbers have remained relatively stable across the state with a very slight increase over the last couple of years. As you all probably know, our English language learner students are not evenly distributed across our state. We have some districts that have essentially no English language learners. And then we have districts on the extreme other end, like Wyndham and Danbury, where 25% or so of their children are English language learners, and districts like Bridgeport that are in the middle between sort of 10 and 15% of their students being English language learners. We've also taken a look here at student poverty. Student poverty is the percentage of children who are living below the federal poverty line. So for a family of 4, this is a little bit more than $20,000 per year. This differs from the FERPL measure. So the free and reduced price lunch measure, for a family of 4, you're going to about $44,000 per year. This is about half that. This is the number of children who are living below the federal poverty line. And as we can see, when we look at that trend line, we can also see that there's been an increase of about 7% over the last 10 years. So on all measures, more high-need kids.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Are you familiar with BCAC?
BCAT, the Bridgeport Coalition for, yeah, okay,
I
yeah.
believe their report says that 40%, is this, in 40% of children in Bridgeport live in poverty, so there's a big difference here.
I would have to look at the report to see specifically what metric they're using. So this is U.S. Census data that is looking at the federal poverty line measure. There are, sometimes people will also call free and reduced price lunch poverty, but it's actually a low income measure. I can look at that report, I'm not sure what metric
It's
they're
such a
using
big
that.
difference, that's why I'm
Yeah,
curious.
it looks like they must be, whatever they're using, they must have a higher income cutoff threshold.
You're just saying that it increased 7%.
Increase, yeah.
Right, so
Yeah.
whatever it
Whatever
is,
the base.
it's
Yeah, but it's 20, it's under
Yeah,
30.
yeah. So it was about 20% and it's almost up to 30%.
Oh,
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying, that's a big difference.
still 10%.
Katie, I read your paper from last
Yeah.
week
Yeah.
on the new thoughts about eligibility not being based on free and reduced lunch. That would hurt us, wouldn't it?
I don't know that it necessarily would. So one of the things that of course hurts Bridgeport now is that we're not actually distributing money to school districts using the education cost sharing formula or a formula at all. So I think a system in which we're both accurately measuring students in need and then allocating resources probably wouldn't hurt Bridgeport. If you're asking, would your number go down from 100%? It almost certainly would, right? Because you don't have 100% of your kids.
So wouldn't Title I be affected?
No, because Title I isn't measured
It's
in the same way, and I think that they're also going to have to make changes to how they distribute Title I because they're going to run into the same free and reduced price lunch problem. So the federal government is also going to have to come up with a new way of how they allocate Title I funds. But there have been different points in Connecticut's history where we've used a different measure than the federal government. The federal government has not yet figured out what measure they're going to use to replace free and reduced price lunch. We'd love for them to do that so we could see what it will
But
be.
right now, they're using free and reduced lunch.
Right now, they're using free and reduced price
So
lunch.
if they don't use that, it will,
Yeah, it likely will affect Bridgeport. Although I think Bridgeport, because these are generally relative measures, right? So Bridgeport is still likely to be one of the highest need communities, regardless of what measure they use. So that means that Bridgeport is still likely to be eligible for one of the top amounts of funding.
Katie was about 95 prior to that.
It was about 95 prior to SEP, yeah. So it wasn't an enormous increase after SEP, but yeah. But this is all sort of stuff that is gonna be in flux over the next couple of years. What metric are we using to measure what students are low income? What are the feds doing? What is Connecticut gonna change to? What everybody knows, Brookings actually just put out a paper on this yesterday, is that free and reduced price lunch is not gonna be sufficiently accurate, because you're gonna see districts, the thing that is disadvantageous to Bridgeport is you're gonna see districts that are much less poor than Bridgeport go to 100%, which would make them appear to be having the same level of need among their students, and therefore making them eligible for sort of the same level of funding, and you don't want to see that, right?
Amount of money. So.
Right. You want to make sure that you have an accurate measure so that you're actually directing the most money toward the highest need communities, rather than having all of these people suddenly go to 100% without any variation on who actually has more need than who. So I think even if your number on whatever new measure the state and the feds use is lower than what it appears to be, it'll still likely be relatively high as compared to other school districts, making Bridgeport eligible for the higher end amount of funding. Massachusetts actually switched over to the federal poverty line last year, which is much lower for all districts. But of course, again, it's a relative measure. So even though everybody's number went down, it didn't impact the highest need districts getting the most funding. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes. So one of the things that I did put in here is a slide that compares Bridgeport student poverty rate to the poverty rates of peer towns. Again, this is the percentage of children living below the federal poverty line. And I put this in because it's different than the free and reduced price lunch numbers. So we see Bridgeport is at 27%, Waterbury is at 32%, New Haven is at 34%, and Hartford is at 39%. As compared to, if we look at New Haven's free and reduced price lunch number, they're at about 57% currently. So there at the moment is not a great relationship between these two numbers, so this is something that will be being sorted out over the next couple of years. We do obviously see that some of the other towns in Fairfield County have significantly lower numbers of children living below the federal poverty line than Bridgeport. So neighboring Stratford is at 11%, other side neighboring Fairfield at 4%, and Norwalk at 14%. Yeah, here I have the free and reduced price lunch numbers so we can see them side by side. So we can see that your percentage of low-income students is registering as higher than in similar communities. And again, there's some difference here because there's differences in the cutoffs, right? So you're seeing for free and reduced price lunch a much higher income cutoff than you're seeing for the federal poverty level. So you wouldn't expect those numbers to exactly mirror each other. Yeah.
I don't know, there's a lot of slides here,
Yeah.
and a lot to go, and not that much time for some of us, so I don't know if there's a way to focus on which parts are.
Sure. Yeah. You want me
21
to?
pages.
Yeah. You want?
Well, no. We need to, as board members, we
And
need,
some of us have to leave at 5:30, so.
okay, but we need to see we need to see
Okay.
it
Let's
all.
see. I am on.
We went through a lot about property tax
If
evasion.
some of us have to leave, we can also talk to you.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
And we have the PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, I know, I'm just.
I will try to go as fast as I can,
Something
but not so fast
you
that
need
we.
to take your time.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, we need to
I can stay
understand.
here for the entire evening. if you
Yeah,
want.
we need to,
All right. And certainly, if you have to leave at 5:30 and you have questions that we don't get to, please don't hesitate to be in touch. I'm happy to do any follow-up. Here's where we first start to look at per pupil spending in more detail. So we can see that despite the fact that Bridgeport in general serves higher needs students, they are spending less than similar districts and less than the state average. So we have pulled up, we can not show every district in the state on the slide. So we always try to pick a group of districts, some of which are geographically similar to wherever we're presenting, and some of which are socioeconomically similar to the places where we're presenting. So the comparison communities that we'll see throughout this slide, so we have Bridgeport, Stratford, Waterbury. We'll always see the state average in every slide. Fairfield, Norwalk, New Haven, and Hartford. And what we'll see here, so we have the per pupil expenditure amounts here. So again, this is when you take the whole school district budget, divide it by their average daily membership, the number of students, you get their per pupil expenditure. This is not the full range of per pupil expenditures in the state. This is just a collection of districts. The full range of per pupil expenditures ranges from, I believe, $12,444 in Woodstock, Connecticut, which is a small district, all the way up to over $30,000 in Cornwall, Connecticut. So we have about an $18,000 per pupil range in expenditures in the state, which is quite significant. The other thing that I have shown on this chart, just to make sure it's clear, are the need indicator percentages underneath. So here you can see the percentage of students in each district who are qualifying as low income under free and reduced price lunch. you're seeing the percentage of students who are identified as English language learners and the percentage of students who are identified as students with disabilities or special education students. So I think, if we look at this slide, right, just to point out a few more features, we see Bridgeport is here at 13,923, and Hartford is over here at 19,362, which is obviously a pretty significant difference in funding, given the fact that these numbers are pretty similar to each other.
So if I could ask a
Yeah.
threshold question, we're all gonna be here advocating for funding, but the outcomes and performance in Hartford at a 40% higher dollar level don't seem to have changed versus Bridgeport. So how do we make the argument that the funding will help? I'm a big believer in it, small class size, but that number is mind-boggling.
Right, so there are a number of things that matter in school finance, right? So one is, does the district have a sufficient amount of resources to buy the things that it needs for its students? And then the second question is, once we give the money to the school districts, how they actually decide to allocate those resources. So we can give a district a sufficient amount of resources, but if they don't allocate that money in ways that actually result in improving student outcomes, we're not going to see an impact on student performance, right? So it's really a two-part solution. You both need to make sure that you have sufficient funding, and then you need to make sure that you're really spending that money wisely on those things that are research-based and that we know actually make a difference for these high-need kids. Hartford is kind of a crazy and a little bit of a special situation because of the Sheff versus O'Neill ruling and the inter-district magnet schools. One of the things that you would see, both if you look at Hartford achievement data and what districts are spending, or what the district is spending on a school-by-school basis, you would see that there are some schools in Hartford that are doing pretty well and other schools in Hartford that are doing pretty poorly. And you'd also likely see some disparity in funding between schools. One of the things that's really difficult is in Connecticut and in many places nationally, we don't currently have information about how much money is being spent per student at the school level. So particularly in our larger districts, it's not possible to compare either across the district or on a statewide basis what is being spent in individual schools. Now, one of the new regulations under the new ESSA, the new Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the replacement for NCLB, or No Child Left Behind. It's the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act. This thing has a bunch of names. One of the things that is going to be required is that districts will begin to be required to provide per pupil expenditures at the school level, which I think will allow us to have a lot more insight to, rather than looking at a district as a whole block, being able to look at the individual schools in the district, the individual performance of those schools, and begin to think about, okay, what resources might we be investing in the schools that are doing better, that are resulting in better student outcomes versus, what are we maybe not investing in the schools that are doing less well. I mean, this is you've hit on one of the very difficult questions of school finance, and one of the reasons that it can be difficult to advocate for more funding is that there isn't a clear straight line between more dollars automatically equal better student outcomes, right? There's this intermediary step of we need to take the resources that we have available and then we need to invest them in the right things before we'll actually get good student outcomes. And unfortunately, we can sometimes have a breakdown in that equation that can lead to high per pupil expenditures without maybe the associated student outcomes that we'd like to be seeing. Okay, moving on to the next slide here. So next we're going to talk a little bit specifically about how our Bridgeport Public Schools funded. And first in here, what we know, of course, this is sort of a statewide look again, is that state and local communities share the responsibility for funding public school districts. So we know that a portion of the money for all public school districts comes from the state, and another portion of the money comes from local government. In Connecticut, we see that there is about $2.5 billion coming from the state in annual operating funds, right? So we saw that bigger $4.1 billion number, but we also talked about the fact that we have teacher pensions included in there and school construction debt, which is why that number is larger. What we see here is the annual grants made to public school districts. Down here we see this is the local contributions in cash, about $5.6 billion. And then the other part of money that comes locally are these in-kind contributions, which I'm not going to talk about at length today, but across the state we have about $404 million in in-kind contributions to public school districts from their associated municipality. And as we can see, district funding sources differ greatly across Bridgeport and your neighboring districts. So this is the same set of districts that we were looking at before: Bridgeport, Stratford, Waterbury, Fairfield, Norwalk, New Haven, and Hartford. At the top, we see the total per pupil expenditure amounts, and then we see the amount coming from each source of funding for the state and local. So in the blue, we see the amount of money that is coming from the local sources, from local property taxes. And in the red, we see the amount of money that is coming from the state. And also, it's important to note, this is not just your education cost sharing grant. This is all state aid for education tied together. And as we can see, there is a significant difference in where resources are coming from district to district. In general, higher need districts in Connecticut do receive more state funding than lower need, higher wealth districts in the state. We do have a funding system that is at least slightly progressive, and we should be grateful that we're not in a state that has a regressive funding system. There are actually states where we see more money going to wealthier school districts from the state, which is not something that you ideally want to see. But we can also see when we're looking at some of our highest need districts, and we'll break these numbers apart in a minute, but we can see that they are receiving very different amounts of state aid, even though, as we talked about before, the needs of the students they're serving are not radically different.
Just want to ask.
Yeah.
So we see that Bridgeport is the lowest on that chart.
Yeah.
And the municipality, we're getting about,
$2,868 per pupil.
and if you were to say how Bridgeport compares to, let's say, Wyndham, Waterbury's already there, are we out of the 100, I think it's 169 school districts?
Yeah.
Right? Where would Bridgeport be on that 169?
I will look it up for you. I don't want to give you the wrong answer. It is low, but I don't know exactly which number. So again, we'll look at some of the, we're actually going to look at just the local numbers compared to each other, but as we can see here, right, we have Bridgeport at 2,868, and we have New Haven at 4,213, and Hartford at 4,240. So as we can see, those districts we know are pretty similar to Bridgeport, and as we can see, they're getting more money in municipal tax dollars.
And can I ask, Kate,
Yeah.
in New Haven, it looks like they're getting more federal. Is that because they've won competitive grants?
I think it is. They got a
They have a huge grant.
they got a huge grant, and
Under Race to the Top.
and I think that that is what you are seeing there. I could dig in and figure out specifically what that is, but they did get a very large multi-year grant that would be included in these numbers, so you would see a little bit of an increase in New Haven's federal money because of that. All right, so looking specifically at state funding, so now what we've done, I have those stacked bars, right, and I broke them apart. So here we're looking just at state funding, right? And we see that Bridgeport receives $9,718 per pupil in state education funding from the state of Connecticut. We've compared this to the other districts that we were looking at. Again, we can see that Stratford is getting about $3,200 per pupil from the state. Waterbury is getting almost $8,600 per pupil. The state average is $3,854. Fairfield, $748, Norwalk, about $1,900, and then we have New Haven receiving $10,500 or so per pupil, and Hartford receiving $13,282. So, how does the state determine how much money each school district should get, right? So we talked, do you have a question? Oh, okay. How does the state determine how much money each school district should get? So the primary way that the state is supposed to determine how much money each city or town should get from the state in order to support its local public school district is the education cost sharing formula. I'm sure you're all very familiar with talking about the education cost sharing formula. So to start with just a little bit of history on why does Connecticut even have the ECS formula to begin with. In 1977 in Connecticut, there was a Connecticut Supreme Court decision called Horton versus Meskel, which many of you may have heard of. I see that Tom Mooney's new book got passed out today, and certainly in that book there's a section on Horton versus Meskel. So in Horton, what the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled is that an education funding system that allows property-wealthy towns to spend much more on education with less effort is a system that impedes children's constitutional right to an education, to an equal education in our state. So basically they said there's a very significant disparity. They didn't say how much disparity between what property wealthy and what property poor towns are able to spend on their public school students, that is something that impedes children's constitutional rights to an equal education. So as a result, Connecticut established a formula to give money to public school districts that took property wealth into consideration. So between 1977 and 1988, there are some other things that they did. If you go to our website, there's actually a document called The History of School Finance in Connecticut that goes all the way back to 1929 and traces the entire evolution of school finance, both through the courts and legislatively. But what we see in 1988 is that Connecticut establishes the first version of the education cost sharing formula for the purposes of providing equalization aid. So in theory, what the ECS grant is supposed to make up is the difference between what a community can afford to pay to run its public schools and what it actually has available. So how is the ECS formula supposed to work? It's actually supposed to be relatively straightforward. So there are 3 variables in the ECS formula that are supposed to determine basically a community's ability to pay versus what the state needs to contribute in order to allow the district to fully fund their public school system. So the first amount is the foundation amount. So this is supposed to represent the average estimated cost of educating a child in the state. And the current foundation amount is $11,525. People will often ask me, via what scientific method did we determine that $11,525 was supposed to be the foundation amount? And the answer is no scientific method. Instead, what they did is they took about the 70th percentile of per pupil expenditures from, I believe it was 2011, 2012, and decided that that would be the foundation amount. Good or bad, up to you to judge, but that's what they did. And that amount is the foundation amount is 11,525. That's 70th percentile number. It wasn't exactly that much money. So that's the first part. So right, every district is supposed to get $1,125 per pupil if that pupil has no needs. In addition, there is a weighting for needs students. So this is supposed to be a calculation that considers the number of students who reside in a town that are typically more expensive to educate. So at this point in time, we only have 1 need weighting in Connecticut. Currently, our only need weighting is a weighting for children who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. The weighting is currently 30% or 0.3. There is no weight for special education students or English language learners. There have been in the past, but they have been taken out. Again, that History of School Finance document will show you the full evolution of this process. And then finally, there is the base aid ratio. So the base aid ratio is basically supposed to split what is it that the state needs to contribute to this district in order for it to have enough money to operate its public schools versus what is the community's ability to pay for public schooling through their own property tax dollars. The base aid ratio takes 2 factors into account. It takes the equalized net grand list per capita, which is essentially the amount of taxable property per person in the town, and it weights that at 90%, so that's essentially a measure of property wealth. And then it takes median household income, which is a little bit more self-explanatory, and weights that at 10%, and that can sort of be seen as a measure of how much money do people actually have available to them in their pockets to pay their property taxes. So the formula is supposed to be relatively straightforward. In the appendix, you'll see a full calculation of the ECS formula for a sample town. But in summary, it's the foundation times the need students times the base aid ratio will give you the town's entitlement to the ECS grant. But we have some problems and complications with the ECS formula. So first, as we've talked a little bit about, it doesn't fund all students based on their learning needs. So as we see, the ECS formula currently only provides extra funding for students who are low income, which we're currently measuring as eligibility for free and reduced price lunch. There are many other students who have special learning needs that require additional resources to give them access to the same opportunities. English language learners and students with disabilities are two key examples of that. Interestingly, we've also been doing a lot of work around special education finance lately. And Connecticut is one of only 4 states that does not have a separate system for funding all special education students. So as many of you may know, we do have the excess cost grant, which is essentially a high-risk grant that is meant to kick in additional funding for students who have extraordinarily high education costs. So once the cost of educating a pupil exceeds 4.5 times that district's per pupil expenditure, the education cost, the excess cost grant kicks in. The idea being that it will reimburse the district. However, that grant is capped. So currently, in this next year, districts will get back about 63 cents on the dollar from excess costs. But there is no funding specifically to cover the remainder of the special education students, which is the majority of the special education students. Connecticut did something somewhat unusual. In 1995, Connecticut decided to incorporate its special education grant into the education cost sharing grant and to make the funding for special education students incorporated into the foundation amount, which is a little bit of a strange thing to do because it sort of makes the assumption that both special education students are evenly distributed in districts across the state and that the cost of educating special education students is like relatively normal, and we know that it isn't, right? There are significant differences in the cost of providing services to special education students depending on that child's specific learning needs. It may, you may have a child who needs some supplemental speech and language assistance that is getting maybe 1 hour of support a week, all the way up to very high need children who may be in self-contained programs and need really intensive services. Obviously, the cost of educating those children is not going to be the same.
So I just want to ask a question on
Yeah.
that. So we're spending 13.9 in Bridgeport.
Yep.
According to the last 14-15 data you
Yeah.
have. You're saying we have to reach 4.5 times that
Yes.
in servicing a special ed student to get 1 penny. And
To get 63 cents for every dollar
after
after.
the 4.5.
That's correct.
So it really only helps the out of district especially.
Yeah, so we're not really, it's really somewhere around below 60,000, which we do have some students certainly that exceed that, but the majority of our students are around 49,000 plus transportation, which you can't count.
You can't count transportation?
I don't think you can count transportation by the excess cost grant.
No.
So
No.
13.
So it's your tuition, so the excess cost doesn't excite me.
Transportation's a huge expense,
Of course.
unfortunately. So you're saying we have to hit basically, am I correct, over about $63,000
Mhm.
before the state will give us 63 cents of reimbursement only on anything above 63,000?
That's correct.
So nothing on the 63. Once you hit over 63,000, we can get 63 cents on the dollar for anything above the 63.
Mhm.
And bus transportation, not
Mhm.
It's not included.
So there's a moment on why this seems a little crazy to people, right? Okay, so second, issue number 2. So the state can't fully fund the education cost sharing formula. So in order to fully fund the most recent version of the formula, which is the 2013 version of the formula, it would cost Connecticut more than $600 million than the state is currently spending. As you may be aware, Connecticut is currently in a fiscal crisis, and as a result, they don't currently have additional funds available to allocate to ECS. One pause I just want to add in here is that, the ECS fully funded amount has really been aspirational for a long period of time, right? It's been a number much larger than what they're spending. And in states that have had luck fully implementing their funding formulas, they have generally set a much narrower phase-in time period. So the phase-in period for the 2013 formula exceeded 20 years, which is a really long time in the future. States that have been successful with their phase-ins normally set somewhere between a 5 and a 10-year phase-in, so sort of a period into the foreseeable future, which, you know, most of us believe we might be here for. The result of the state not having enough money to fully fund the ECS formula is that it then, of course, does not have enough money to pay each city or town the amount that it is technically owed under the education cost sharing formula. So as a result, most cities and towns get far less money than they're actually entitled to. We'll take a look at that in a little more detail in a few minutes. Another issue, Connecticut has stopped using the education cost sharing formula to distribute funding to districts. So the state stopped using the ECS formula altogether to distribute education funding to school districts in 2013, which obviously opens the door to beginning to fund schools based on politics rather than the needs of kids and communities. So this year, all districts received, well, almost all districts received cuts. They received them in varying percentages depending on their need, but the base number is the amount of money you received last year, right? So the primary driver and how much ECS funding you're going to get this year is how much funding you received last year. So it does not take into account, and I think we'll see this in the next slide, it does not take into account changes in the number of students a district serves, the learning needs of those students, or the community's ability to pay. So those factors, people will have all these questions about resident student counts and if we have more enrollment or if these children go here. The number of children in your resident student count has nothing to do with how much money your school district gets anymore. It is based on how much money you got last year plus whatever up or downward percent adjustment that the state decides to make in the budget. Both Kathy Dempsey and Kathy Dempsey is the Chief Financial Officer for the State Department of Education, tried to back into this year's ECS grant amounts using what the Office of Fiscal Analysis put out. Neither Kathy or I can back into those numbers, which means that they're not doing what they said they did, at least not exactly. We can get close, but we can't quite get there. So the important facts that I want to drive home, and this, you know, I think particularly matters for our higher need, lower wealth districts, is that if the number of students goes up or down, the ECS grant does not change accordingly. If the number of low income students goes up or down, the ECS grant amount does not change accordingly. And if the community's ability to pay goes up or down, for example, you have a significant drop in your grant list, the ECS grant amount does not change accordingly. Instead, what we're doing at this point is increasing or decreasing your ECS grant amount on a percentage basis based on the amount that the district received last year. The outcome here is that the result isn't equitable, right? So we see that some towns are getting more funding they're entitled to, while other communities get less than they should. Groton currently receives, that's my hometown actually, receives about $4.1 million or 19% more than they're technically entitled to under ECS, while Bridgeport receives $43 million or 19% less than they would technically be entitled to under ECS. And there are a number of reasons that situations like Groton happened. The most significant of them was a situation called hold harmless. So basically what was happening is that even if your school district enrollment declined, even if it declined considerably, there was no downward adjustment to the ECS grant. So even if they ran the formula and it said, okay, you're getting more funding than the ECS formula says you should get, the rule was that they didn't reduce your funding amount, they just left it the same year after year. And in places like Groton, where they've seen really significant enrollment declines over the last 10 years, right, this has had the impact of them becoming significantly overfunded under ECS. Groton is sort of a unique situation playing out here. As many of you may know, the United States Naval Submarine Base is based in Groton, and the Department of Defense has been stationing far fewer sailors there over the last 10 years. There have also the economic shifts have been particularly difficult for southeastern Connecticut, and as a result, they've just had a significant decline in their public school district enrollment. But because we didn't just let the formula run, the result was that, you know, over a 10-year time period, you ended up with Groton receiving significantly more money than they were technically entitled to under the formula. And then, of course, you run into a fiscal crisis and someone comes up with the idea to just take it all away at once, but that creates a separate problem for the district, right? You can't just suddenly yank
Right.
some huge amount of money out of the district and expect that in 1 year that they're going to adjust. The better, you know, public policy solution would be that, you know, if there are enrollment changes over time, that you gradually adjust the funding amounts so that you don't have this situation where you run into a fiscal crisis and then think, oh my goodness, we need to take away all the overfunding. Yeah.
Was ECS implemented because of Horton and Mesco, or no? Because it looks like it was 11 or 13 years
Yeah,
after
so
the law.
it was, and if you look at the history of school finance timeline, you'll see that basically between 1977 and 1988, they tried a couple of other ideas. One of them was contested by the Horton plaintiffs. They came up with a new idea, which ended up being the ECS formula. So it wasn't sort of a direct path. But you know, in general, it does take the state a while to sort of determine how they're going to handle a court ruling, right? And I think the more recent one we can look at is Sheff, which was decided in 1996, but it essentially took until the early 2000s for the legislature to sort of figure out exactly what they were going to do and begin to set up the interdistrict magnet system and actually begin to integrate Hartford Public Schools. Government is just not a super fast moving body, and a lot of these things are difficult to do, so it can take some time.
And a follow-up is, how can they walk away from the ECS formula in 2013? Isn't that what they presented to a judge to say this is how we're going to fix it?
No, so the Horton versus Meskel case is not under court supervision. That case was, I think, closed out in the late 80s. So no, the legislature can do whatever they want really with how they distribute education aid. So we also see that communities with similar needs receive very different amounts of education funding. So there is a $5,000 per pupil gap in just state funding between New Britain and Hartford, and we'll see a slide on that. And then this is not a topic we're going to talk about at any length today, but additionally the ECS formula doesn't apply to all kids in all schools. So we also have this like crazy matrix of additional school funding systems to fund. We have 5 different formulas for magnet schools. We have another formula for VOAG schools. We have another formula for open choice schools. There's another system for funding the Connecticut Technical High School system, another system for charter schools. So it goes on and on. What we see as the result is that there's no correlation between the percentage of low-income students a district serves and per pupil expenditures. So what you see down here is the percentage of low-income students the district serves, and what we see here are per pupil expenditures. So as you can see here, we have our highest need districts in the state, and you see that there's a significant range in what those per pupil expenditures are. In the middle, we just sort of have folks all over the place, and then these are some of the most affluent small districts in the state, have some of the highest per pupil expenditures, but also some of the lowest need. The same thing happens if we look at the correlation between the percentage of English language learners a student serves and per pupil expenditures. Again, you're going to see that there's no correlation at all here. So how does this impact cities and towns? So I talked a little bit about the over and under funding. So what we see here is that some cities and towns receive much less than they should under ECS. You can see Bridgeport is here, receiving about $43 million less than they should under ECS. But the other thing I want to point out here is a column that doesn't get very much attention, but it's sort of it's the percent underfunded column, right? So it's how close are you to being fully funded? And what we see here is that, these numbers are all over the place. We have, 60% here, and we have 10% here. And this is because every new formula has always been based off of the past, right? So every time there's sort of an update to the formula, what they are always doing is basing it on historical precedent, so the amount of money that you're already getting. So, if you have a city that's sort of here and a city that's here, and we add 10% to both, well, we both get more, but we just go here, right? There's no opportunity for the folks who are far behind to actually catch up. So when you have this system, you once you have these inequities in the system, there isn't a method by which we have a plan for resolving that inequity. We just, you know, everybody gets more, but you never close the gap. So I actually think, you know, all of the columns are important, but that, you know, this is the one that is most concerning when you think about sort of the dysfunction of a school finance system. You shouldn't have, you know, some districts that are receiving 10% less than what they should be receiving, and some districts that are receiving 60% less. That's just crazy, yeah.
When Malloy had his ECS task force, it
Yeah.
said that on a cash basis, not percentage,
Yeah.
Bridgeport was the most underfunded school district. Are you saying just in a couple of years now that Waterbury's moved that far?
So I believe Waterbury was also the most underfunded school district
On
at
a
that
cash
point in time, on a
basis?
cash basis, yeah.
Mhm.
Waterbury has always been far behind. But Bridgeport is second in far behind, but yeah, they did, you know, work to catch up Bridgeport and Waterbury a little bit through the Alliance District program. But yeah, we don't think about Waterbury a lot, but we do see that Waterbury is quite far behind.
I think also the changes in the percentages, for example, in Hamden, when that formula was built, it didn't take into account the number of Navy students. That changed dramatically in a couple of years.
Right. So yeah, so now that we sort of have this historical precedent built in and the changes in your need students don't matter, when we actually